Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the final lecture for this course. And this last one is going to be not so much about critical reasoning per se, but about an application of critical reasoning to the field of ethics. Um, in fact, in this unit, we'll actually also apply critical reasoning to a few other related fields. So we'll talk a little bit also about philosophy of law, a little bit about um, aesthetics or the philosophy of art, but primarily we will be applying critical reasoning to ethics. Now, if we think about ethics and what it is, if you go on to study ethics in a philosophy course, I think you can sort of usefully break down ethics into a couple of different questions. One fundamental aspect of ethics is about whether there are things that are valuable in this world. So there are questions about what is good. Uh, and the idea that philosophers have here is that they're thinking about whether something has what they often call intrinsic value. Intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is usefully contrasted with instrumental value. And the idea is that whereas lots of things have instrumental value, it's far less clear which things, if any, have intrinsic value. To have instrumental value is to be valuable as an instrument toward the attainment of other things. So, for example, money is valuable, but it's valuable only because of things that it can get you. It's valuable because you can trade that money in for things that you really want. Now, there's a very old philosopher's idea. Aristotle had this idea a long time ago that if we start listing out these things that are instrumentally good, well, I want the money so that I can get a car. And I want the car because of uh, the ease with which I'll be able to get to my job. And I want that for something else, and I want that for something else. And the idea here is that we're often one of these philosophers' regresses. And so the natural question is where this chain of valuings or desirings or instrumentally valuable things stops. There has to be, says Aristotle, there has to be something at the top of this chain that you value not for the sake of something further, but for its own sake. And that's the idea of an intrinsically valuable thing, right? So Aristotle's thought is we can have this kind of chain of instrumentally valuable things, but it must terminate somewhere. It must terminate in something that's somehow valuable in and of itself. The alternatives seem to be objectionable on conceptual grounds. It seems, for example, that the chain just can't go on forever. It's unclear how one would even begin to start valuing anything in that scenario. And moreover, it doesn't seem possible for the chain to loop around. If everything is valuable for something else, then it's not clear why I would break into this circle to begin with. And moreover, if indeed the chain stops somewhere, it seems as though it must terminate in something that has value and yet has that value independently of what it can get me. That is, it must have value in and of itself. Okay, so there's this sort of broad question about whether there are things in this world that are somehow intrinsically good. And notice, if they're intrinsically good, then they're objectively good, right? They have their goodness, they have their value in themselves, whether or not people realize it, whether or not a culture realizes it, whether or not people actually value it. Uh, we get this potential for things that are valuable objectively without anybody ever actually valuing them. So it's useful to distinguish between the idea that something has value in and of itself, and the idea that something has value because people value it. Okay. Now, question: what sorts of candidates are there for things that are intrinsically valuable? Well, Aristotle himself um, talked about what, in his words, he called eudaimonia. That's obviously a Greek word. Eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, and that's not a bad translation. But it just needs to be borne in mind that what Aristotle has in mind here is not some sort of feeling. It's not just this kind of transitory, oh, I feel good today feeling. Eudaimonia is supposed to be a a life well lived. Sometimes it's translated as flourishing. Right? What is it that has intrinsic value? It's a life well lived. John Stuart Mill, whom I will talk about in a minute, thought that the only intrinsically valuable thing was happiness. And he really did seem to have in mind something more like the feeling, pleasure, he says. He says happiness is really just pleasure in the absence of pain. So his thought is all of these chains of instrumentally valuable things terminate sensibly only in pleasure. Right? The only reason to do anything is for the sake of pleasure. Now he had it in mind that you would be considering not just your own pleasure, but everybody else's pleasure as well. Still, the only thing that would be valuable in and of itself for a human being is pleasure. Mill's thought that happiness includes the absence of pain brings up the interesting sort of opposite idea that there might be things in this world that are somehow intrinsically disvaluable. Right? Are there things that have a kind of disvalue in and of themselves? Pain might be a good candidate for that. Perhaps death. There may be other candidates as well. Um, we might disagree with Aristotle or with Mill. We might think that there are things other than happiness or a life well lived that seem intrinsically valuable. Perhaps love, perhaps education. Love and education, notice they can bring challenges, they can bring pain, but one might nevertheless think that having them is valuable regardless of the negative consequences that they may engender. Okay, so that's one aspect of ethics. Questions about the good. Are there things that are valuable? And in particular, are there things that have intrinsic value? Are there things that we ought to be pursuing uh, uh, just for their own sake, right? Just because that thing itself is valuable. This leads to an impulse to assess the value of states of affairs or worlds. An ethicist might consider different worlds that result from different choices or different starting conditions. And if we have some sense of which things are valuable, then we can measure those things in some sense between those two scenarios and say, this is a better world. Right? This world has more pleasure in it. That makes it a better world. Things like that. Now, uh, another way that we can think about different worlds resulting from a starting place is by human action. And of course, this leads into a second broad topic of ethics, which is questions about right action, questions about how I ought to behave, and questions about the right and questions about the good may very well be, and probably are, very intimately linked. One might suppose, in fact, that uh, if I have a choice between creating, say, a world with more pleasure in it and a world with less pleasure in it, then perhaps I have some obligation to produce the world with the better uh, uh, outcomes, the world with the more pleasure or the more intrinsically valuable things, whatever we take those to be. But in any case, this second aspect of ethics is about what I ought to do. How ought I to behave? Do I have obligations to perform certain actions? Do I have obligations not to perform certain actions? We can ask also questions about whether people have certain fundamental rights or duties. Uh, and these might intersect with questions about the good in very interesting ways. The idea of a right, for example, seems to be the idea that, if I've got a right to something, then it seems like I've got a claim on someone or something uh, to have something guaranteed to me. And it seems as though that promise, that claim, is to be honored regardless of what sorts of pain may result from granting me that thing to which I'm entitled. Right? That seems to be the notion of a right, is that I have this claim on this thing, the thing to which I have a right, regardless of the good or the bad that may arise from granting me that right, or from granting me the thing to which I have the right. Clearly, because ethics concerns itself with how we ought to behave, there is a kind of immediately practical relevance to ethics. Um, and of course, that's distinctive about ethics compared to lots of other branches of philosophy. I hope that critical reasoning has some immediate application for you. But there are certainly lots of more recherche branches of philosophy that do not have sort of obvious, everyday, real world applications. One might sort of ask really interesting questions about uh, the fabric of the universe, or whether mathematical objects exist or engage in other sort of uh, metaphysical philosophical questions, without those questions having sort of immediate implications for practical life. But ethics is precisely about what I ought to do with my practical life. What ought I to be doing? Um, and of course, this is a very familiar idea. We often grow up with rules, or we sort of have some vague idea, maybe just through our own intuition, about how we ought to live our lives. It seems to be wrong in general to hurt other people. It seems to be wrong in general to lie, and so on. And probably there are exceptions to those things, but nevertheless, those ideas formed at a very early age do seem to have a kind of relevance and truth, um, for how we ought to govern our lives. Now, there are really two broad reasons for talking about ethics in this course. Um, the first is what I just said, really, that making moral judgments is one of the most familiar things we do. We judge other people for their behavior. We judge ourselves for our behavior. We make judgments all the time about which things are good. We say it's good that so and so won that award. It's bad that so and so won that award. Uh, it's a shame that so and so acted that way to you. We make these judgments all the time. And the judgments that we're making are the result often, I'll say much more about this in a minute, but are the result often of some kind of reasoning process. And so it is an application of critical reason, and it's one that we do every day. Okay, that's reason number one. Reason number two for talking about ethics in this class is that I think by looking at the shape of such reasoning, the way in which we come to our moral judgments, we can actually understand quite a lot about the general method of philosophy. about how philosophy works quite generally. And so this is in a way my sort of way of advertising to you to keep studying philosophy, because when we sort of explore how this kind of moral reasoning works, I think you get a really good picture of what philosophy looks like. And of course, I'm hopeful that it'll be an attractive picture to you. Let me say a bit more about each one of these points. Um, as far as the first one goes, that making moral judgments is a familiar thing, that we do it all the time, and that it's a sort of natural and easy application of critical reasoning. Um, just think about the moral issues that face us today in society, about which people have strong views, often opposing views. Uh, Questions about abortion, questions about prostitution or the death penalty, or paying taxes, or just everyday actions that we make or that others make. These these issues come up all the time, and behind these opinions that we form, these judgments that we make, there is often, again, some process of reasoning going on. And that's just to say that we can give arguments for moral opinions. We can give arguments for moral opinions. It doesn't have to be just, the pro-life person and the pro-choice person staring at each other in unbelief. We can make arguments. Uh, Imagine that you have the view that capital punishment is wrong, that a state does not have the right to sentence people to death for transgressions that those people have made against the state. Okay. Um, well, here's an underlying principle that might be sort of the motivation for having that view. Maybe something like, it's wrong very generally to um, kill adult human beings, maybe something like that. Okay. Uh, and so here's an argument, right? General principle: killing people is wrong, or killing adult human beings is wrong. Capital punishment is a form of killing adult human beings, therefore, capital punishment is wrong. Okay. There's a nice, valid argument for the claim that capital punishment is wrong. Now, it's controversial. If we're asking whether the argument is sound, then we're asking whether the premises are true. And of course, that's not clear. Um, I suppose it's undoubtable that capital punishment is indeed a form of killing adult human persons. But of course, we also relied on this general principle to the effect that killing people is wrong. And that's, of course, much more controversial. There are many cases of killing that don't seem wrong. For example, killing a person in self-defense or in defense of your family, perhaps killing a person um, to put that person out of some terrible pain that that person is in, when there's not much promise of a better life beyond that pain. These all seem like potentially good reasons for killing, and so if they are, then we're going to have a challenge awaiting this premise that says that killing people is wrong. Nevertheless, right, we were able to construct this piece of reasoning for taking a moral position. And it's always fair to ask someone who states a moral position how that person came to that view, especially, of course, when that view is controversial. One thing that it's always valuable for a philosopher to do, or for anyone to do for that matter, is to try to drill down into why someone has the position that that person has. Um, you have this belief about capital punishment. Why? Why do you think that? Right? And of course, the as we've been saying this whole time, right? The answer better be something like some reason, some justification, something behind that belief, some principle that could explain in a more intuitive way how this result comes about. how this conclusion can be derived. Um, let's say a word about the second reason again in more depth. So remember, the second reason for talking about ethics in this class was that uh, by looking at the shape of ethical reasoning, we can really say something about the method of philosophy quite generally. Now, the typical way of going about a sort of intro ethics class, um, often if you're just thinking about how to do ethics, well, the first thing I think to do is to sort of suss out your ethical intuitions. I seem to have these intuitions about ethics. I have intuitions to the effect that, you know, killing is usually wrong, that liberty is generally important, that I ought not to invade people's space or homes in general, and so on and so on and so on. I've got 100,000 different ethical intuitions. And then the task is to try to find principles. Again, this should sound familiar, right? The task is to try to find principles that explain this very diverse set of intuitions that we have. It's useful, I think, to compare and to contrast this kind of method of philosophy with the method of science. Scientists, in their work, have a kind of inclination to systematic principles. The whole idea behind science is to take a diverse and diffuse set of observations or evidence and to try to craft a theory that can explain those observations. And of course, that theory ought to have predictive consequences. It ought to be testable. So, for example, um, you know, think about the brilliant gravitational theory of Isaac Newton that was developed in the 17th century. Um, of course, it had been observed for a very long time that massive things tend to fall toward Earth, right? Apples fall toward the Earth when they, um, become too heavy for their boughs to hold them. Wounded animals fall to Earth when, they're no longer able to support themselves. Uh, Feathers fall to Earth when they become detached from flying birds. And of course, the move to science is to say, look, this can't just be a sort of coincidence that all these different things happen to fall to Earth, right? Presumably, there's something that explains why all of these things are falling to Earth. It's not something about the fact that feathers and animals and apples are primarily made of earth, as Aristotle had said, and that Earth's natural place is below our feet. That works, that works reasonably well as a scientific theory, but it doesn't have the kind of generality that Newton's theory has. Newton's theory also explains why the moon has this effect on the tides and many other things associated with gravitational theory. Right? So this huge, sprawling gravitational theory, um, though there is a kind of a mathematical precision to it and a kind of strangeness to it, a kind of counterintuitiveness to it. Why should it be that the force between two objects is proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them? That's certainly not obvious at all. But the point is that it has these very predictable and testable consequences, which we can very much see very readily. We can measure this. We can measure the, you know, acceleration of objects as they're affected by gravitational fields. And we can verify that Newton's theory, in its sort of mathematical predictions, is actually quite accurate. Now, never mind the fact that it breaks down in certain cases, and we have to come up with another theory to explain relativistic physics and blah, blah, blah. But ignoring 20th century physics for a moment, Newton's theory has this incredible systematicity. It's simple. It explains a wildly diverse set of phenomena. And it's complex, and it makes these predictions that we can test. Beautiful example of a scientific theory. Now, how does this work for philosophy? Well, we don't have the laboratories. We don't have the observations. We don't have evidence in the same sort of way. But what we do have, and I was just saying that this is what we start with when we do ethics, we have our intuitions. We have the deliverances of our intuition applied to certain conceptual scenarios. I have an intuition about the wrongness of killing. I have an intuition about the importance of liberty, and so on. And the idea, again, so here's where the parallel to science comes in, right? The idea is that there ought to be some simple, fundamental, deep theory that explains and systematizes all of these diverse intuitions that I have. Here's one ethical view that does that. There's a view called utilitarianism. I mentioned John Stuart Mill earlier. Utilitarianism was his view. And the idea is, first of all, that happiness is the only intrinsically valuable thing, which Mill cashes out in terms of presence of pleasure, absence of pain. And further, that what we ought to do, so now we're talking about the other part of ethics, the right, what we ought to do is, in fact, to maximize pleasure, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. Happiness is valuable. We should be maximizing happiness. Okay. If that's all ethics is, then this would be a sort of wonderfully amazing synthesis of lots of different ethical intuitions that we have. Why is it that it's usually wrong to lie to people? Well, maybe we could cash that out in terms of happiness. When people find out that you lied to them, it tends to make them very unhappy. It can destroy a friendship, which can make you unhappy in the long run. Why is it that it's wrong to hurt people? Well, it tends to make them very unhappy. And if their happiness is something that matters objectively, that has intrinsic value, then that could explain why it's wrong to do these things. Now notice, you might be thinking, well, we said earlier that money is not intrinsically valuable. Can we explain on this view why it's wrong to take people's money? But I think we can, right? Because taking people's money tends also to make them unhappy. So here the idea would be that, what makes stealing wrong is not so much the theft per se, but it's the effect that the theft has on the happiness of the person from whom you've stolen. Interesting, powerful view, right? There are plenty of utilitarians to this day. Sometimes they have somewhat different views from what Mill expressed, but close enough that they still want to call themselves Millians and utilitarians. And this is an interesting view, right? It's a powerful view. It's one that explains lots of different ethical intuitions that we have. Maybe we can explain everything about ethics in terms of happiness, right? The reason why I ought to pursue my own intellectual talents, or my musical talents, or whatever talents I have to do with the happiness that I can bring for myself or for the people who can benefit from those abilities. The reason why it's wrong to act in all these different ways toward people maybe has to do with the happiness that you deprive them of. Okay? So, in the case of science, we've got a bunch of evidence, we've got a bunch of observations, and they're disparate and they're different. But we want some simpler, deeper theory that can explain all of them together. In the case of philosophy, same kind of structure. It's just that instead of having observations or evidence, we've got the things that our intuition tells us. And we still want, again, some deeper, fundamental, simple theory that can synthesize all those things together and explain them. This kind of dialogue of, here are some intuitions I have, here's a theory that can explain them, here are some other intuitions I have that seem to refute this theory that you're trying to use to explain all these intuitions. Okay, here's another theory that can explain that further intuition, right? That is the substance of philosophy. If you go read a bunch of professional philosophy papers, they look very much like this. I have this intuition to this effect. Here's a theory that explains that. Here's my objection to that theory. And what is this objection based on? Probably some further intuition that I have. Right? Okay, maybe we throw that theory out. Here's another theory that's more general and that can explain not just these intuitions we tried to explain before, but also this other one you had that prompted the objection to the first theory. Obviously, we've been talking about ethics, but really this is the substance of all philosophy, at least Western philosophy. Here's how this might look in the case of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that has to do with the sort of ultimate furniture of the world. Which things exist? Are there things that exist that are sort of beyond the sensible realm? And am I able to know those things exist through some kind of exercise in reason? Can I prove using rational argument that God exists? Can I prove using rational argument that numbers exist or that properties exist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I might, for example, have a kind of metaphysical intuition to the effect that two objects cannot occupy the same place at the same time. Okay. But then someone smart comes along and says, well, consider a statue made out of clay. I can smash the statue and that destroys the statue while the clay survives. And the fact that the statue is gone while the clay is still there seems to suggest that actually there were two objects there before I smashed it. There was the clay and there's the statue. So then I think, well, okay, maybe I can have two objects occupying the same place at the same time. Or I develop some theory to try to explain that intuition or to explain it away, and so on and so on and so on. Or here's an example from epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophical branch that has to do with knowledge. What is knowledge? Do we have any of it? What is it for me to have a justified belief in something as opposed to merely believing something haphazardly? I might have an intuition about when someone counts as having knowledge and when someone doesn't. And those intuitions might support or conflict with theories about what knowledge is. And if I'm doing philosophy, then I'm talking about that conflict, right? I'm saying, well, here's a theory about what knowledge is. Okay, but I have this intuition that conflicts with that theory about what knowledge is. So here's my theory about what knowledge is that explains my intuition about what knowledge is. Notice this understanding of the nature of philosophy isn't probably going to get us very far unless there is a pretty commonly held group of intuitions. And I'm relatively optimistic about this. I think there actually are lots of uh, intuitions that are more or less commonly held among human beings. Certainly, there is cultural difference. Certainly, there is difference in oneself as one ages and so on. But I think intuitions about very fundamental things are fairly universal. And, you know, I think universal enough that we may hope for some very powerful theories, philosophical theories, that can explain and account for all those intuitions that we have. I think that's it. Um, if you are a critical reasoning student, then thank you very much for the course. I've enjoyed it. This ability that we have to test judgments, to compare them, to try to explain or to justify them, to challenge them, to ask why they are believed, to ask someone, why did you make that judgment? Why do you have that belief? Clearly, I think that that kind of strategy and the tools you have for developing that discussion, obviously, I hope should be relevant to you very much in your ordinary lives beyond your philosophy classes. If you are a uh, a moral problem student, thank you very much. We are just getting started. But that is a picture of what morality looks like, what moral reasoning looks like, and why reasoning, why making arguments can be brought to bear on these topics. Why ethics is not just a matter of I'm emoting my feelings and you're emoting your feelings, and that's all we can do. There does seem to be this level on which we can relate to each other. We can question each other's premises. We can try to find some common ground from which to start. And it may turn out that we value different things. It may turn out that we have different intuitions. But we can at least make progress beyond disagreement at the very highest level. We can drill down and try to find out where exactly our disagreement lies. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. We'll call that good for now.